Hello and welcome to Devil's Advocate. With the Air India pilot strike continuing, we ask, how did the airline get into this unholy mess? That's the key issue I should explore today with the Civil Aviation Minister, Ajit Singh. Mr. Ajit Singh, let's start at the beginning. In 2007, the UPA government merged two airlines with entirely different pay scales, work conditions, areas of operation, and as a result, they were two airlines with entirely different cultures and ways of doing things. Would you accept this was by no means an ideal merger?
See, what we are looking at now is a retrospect. At that point in time, they thought maybe there'll be a lot of synergies. They'll save money on buying fuel, they'll have the same marketing force. So I don't know what the circumstances were. But looking at it now, it definitely hasn't worked out. And another reason may be that even that merger hasn't really taken place in many areas.
In fact, I'll come to this second issue about the merger not taking place.
Yes.
But let me first explore what you said at the beginning. The merger hasn't worked out. You accept that?
Yes, in retrospect, it seems like, as you pointed out, they have different pay scales, different areas of operation, different culture.
So would you also then say that the merger was a mistake?
But then if you go back, even if you look at the mergers in this area in US and other places, a lot of mergers have failed. So there may be could be many other reasons for the failure.
Quite right. Yeah. So this is one of many mergers that hasn't succeeded.
It hasn't worked out as people at that time might have thought. And of course, it's true that up to 2005, both these companies were making profit.
Quite
and
right.
Now, this year, last year, their losses would be around 9,000 crores.
Quite right. So the merger hasn't worked out. You're saying something else as well. Two companies that when they were separate were making profit. Now that they've been merged, are actually making a loss.
But the whole situation also has changed.
Quite right.
If you look across, all airline industry is in trouble.
Let's go back and try and look at the various stages where problems came up. You began by admitting that the merger hasn't worked out. You began by accepting this wasn't an ideal merger. Second.
No, I only said at that time, I don't know what the circumstances were. In retrospect, we can say that it hasn't worked out.
Quite right. In retrospect, we can say it hasn't worked out.
Yes.
Second, even after 5 years, the two airlines operate as separate entities under a single name. For instance, you have two sets of pilots, you have two sets of cabin crew, you even have two directors of engineering. No real effort has been made over 5 years to implement the merger.
See, what I have come to know is that about 70% of what should have happened in merger has taken place. ITs have been merged, in many areas marketing force has been merged, but that key area, different pilots, cabin crew, and engineers working on these two different airlines, HR area basically, hasn't yet been merged, and that's why Justice Dharmadhikari committee was appointed.
Quite right. So you accept that in the key areas of cabin crew, pilots, and engineering staff, the merger hasn't happened?
It hasn't happened.
In fact, a third problem is that where attempts were made to create a merger in these key areas, it's happened either half-heartedly or it's happened irrationally. Let me give you an example. The airline has insisted that both Indian Airlines pilots as well as Air India pilots must be trained for the Dreamliner. But they're not implementing that principle either for the engineering staff or for the cabin crew. So it's been done half-heartedly and irrationally.
See, the pilot's training in a wide body or narrow body is entirely separate ways they go about it.
But it would be logical to have engineering staff training as well.
Pardon, for cabin crew, I don't think that will be the problem.
But what about engineering staff?
Engineering also, going across these lines is much easier than it is for the pilots.
Except it would be rational and logical if you're training pilots from both streams for the Dreamliner, if you were also then to train engineering staff across the airline for the same function.
Yes. See, you are right. Even the pilots, I'm saying it's difficult. They had different streams and all that. But it doesn't mean that it shouldn't happen or it couldn't have happened.
Let's pause for a moment and consider in some detail the decision that both Indian Airlines and Air India pilots will be trained for the Dreamliner. In the case of Air India pilots, because of their experience on the 747 and the 777, they require under 10 days to train on the Dreamliner. In the case of Indian Airlines pilots, because their training has been basically on the Airbus, which is a completely different plane, They require 30 to 35 days of training at a time when your cumulative losses are touching 25,000 crore. This insistence on 50-50 is only adding to your costs, and it's only causing further time delays. Is it wise?
Listen, basically at this point in time, if you are saying we decide whether we undo the merger or keep on with it, if we are going to keep on with the merger, then we have to have this cross-training. Ultimately, there will be one pilot profession. They will be trained in different lines and all that, but doesn't mean that we'll have two entirely different progress path, pay scales and all that.
So you're saying a very important thing. You're saying one consequence of the merger is that the hidden costs, and they're not really hidden any longer, that I referred to, have to be borne. You have to accept them, otherwise the merger makes no sense.
No, you are saying hidden costs, but then also say that if we cross-train, and if we train from this and transfer to them, you still may have advantages sometimes. So
Quite
don't
right.
say that it will cost more.
Except that there's then a contradiction. If it makes sense to train pilots from both streams for the Dreamliner, why does it not make sense at the same time to train engineering staff from both streams?
Yeah, we are planning all that. And
So
even pilots, not only Dreamliner, we have a plan. We have studied the Dharmadekari report, and we will be training pilots.
But do you see what I'm
on
pointing
both
out?
sides. Yeah.
I'm saying to you that the third problem is that even where attempts are being made to create a merged airline, the attempts are either half-hearted or they are irrational or they're contradictory. Pilots are being trained from both streams. Engineering staff are being kept separate, cabin crew are being separate. Instead of doing it all together and making a united merger, there's an attempt at merger in one area, but separation in another.
Mr. Karan Thapar, we all agree that merger hasn't progressed and hasn't happened as it should have. But at this point in time, we have to decide how to implement Dharmadekari report, which takes care of most of these problems.
You know, you keep referring to the Dharmadekari report. It's not been made public as yet. So I have to point out for the audience that you have an advantage there. You know its content, the rest of us don't. But let me put this to you. Even where training is happening for the Dreamliner, it's not necessarily happening in the most rational way. You have in Bombay a simulator that has been lying idle, I'm told, for 5 months because you don't have an instructor. In the meantime, the airline is paying a lot of money to send pilots to Singapore.
Mr. Karan Thapar, if you want to look at these issues, there are many problems like that. The expenses are going up. As you said, training should be done, it hasn't been done. All these issues are there, and these are one of the reasons, not the sole reason, for this problem that Air India is going through.
But you know, this sort of problem, which you acknowledge and accept, suggests that there is no planning, there is no rational thinking, that decisions are being made in an ad hoc, unstructured way. That is a disaster for an airline that needs to merge two different entities which are perhaps not really ready for merger.
See, all I can say is that when they decided on merger, by now merger should have taken place.
Why didn't it? Did they not think these problems through?
Well, I can't say that what problems they had and what they did try, it didn't work.
But
I'm in no position to say that.
Absolutely, because you weren't minister. You only became minister just under 5 months ago.
Yes.
But what we are saying is that your predecessors and what we are saying, the management of the airline in the last 5 years simply wasn't up to the challenge. They didn't know how to handle it.
Mr. Karan Thapar, we are not here to indict the management, past or present. Here, what we are discussing is what the problem with airlines is. The merger didn't take place, we know. Obviously, if the merger didn't take place as planned, something must have gone wrong.
Something very big.
Yes, something must have gone wrong. So, but we are not inquiring into that now. CAG does some inquiring, PAC is looking at those reports. So
Interesting that you should mention the CAG, because that's another problem that I was going to come on to in a moment's time.
I anticipate
that has
you.
Bedeviled the merger and has caused serious problems for Air India. The CAG points out that the government saddled Air India with 68 aircraft at a cost of 40,000 crore on the false assumption that increasing capacity would increase market share, whilst contradictorily at the same time handing over bilaterals and thus undermining the case for having new planes. People look at this and say, this is not just bizarre, it's inexplicable.
Well, I see for a long time they hadn't bought any planes, and that was a complaint also. They should have periodically updated their fleet. But then they bought it at one time, and those questions have been raised. What can I say now?
And the worst thing is,
if you look at it now, what we're trying to do with Dreamliner is that buy and lease, sell and lease. So
that you don't have the burden of the cost.
Capital expenditure is not that high.
Quite right. So you're now trying to find ways out of the commitment made by your predecessors, because you accept that those commitments made in terms of airline purchases were mistaken. They happened in too big a number. They happened all together. And the worst thing is they happened at a time when you were giving away bilaterals. So you were buying planes to take passengers whilst giving away the right to take passengers.
Mr. Karan Thapar, my job is to look at the current situation, see what we can do, of course learn from what went wrong, and make Air India succeed.
Absolutely. You have perhaps the most difficult job in the country, because you're having at the same time to put right an unholy mess without, and I can understand this, wanting to blame your predecessors for creating it. You have to defend them for the mistakes they made, yet correct the mistakes they made, and smile and get on with the job. It's a terrible job you have.
Mr. Karan Thapar, the mistakes they made or not made, or what they did right or wrong, I think you should talk to them also.
Absolutely. But let me come to one further mistake, which perhaps was the worst of the lot. Your predecessors attempted to put together the most challenging merger of all without putting in place a management that could handle that challenge. Instead of appointing civil aviation professionals to run the airline, they kept sending joint secretaries from the IAS who have no idea how to run a business, leave aside a specialized service industry like an airline.
Well, I do agree with you on one point. It's very difficult for government to run service industry, because in service industry to succeed, your culture has to be customer is king. Government servants' culture, that's not included in their culture.
So why then, after creating this challenging merger, were IAS joint secretaries being sent to run the airline rather than find professionals?
Well, that's what government has decided.
But so there was, the funny thing is, there was one brief instance when your predecessors did appoint a civil aviation professional. I'm talking about Gustav Baldorf, who was made Chief Operating Officer. He lasted for just 9 months before he was sacked. And he was sacked because people thought he was objecting to political interference.
Let me point out one more thing, Mr. Karan Thapar. When we are talking why government doesn't succeed in service industry, it's not one appointment, two appointments, the managing director or commercial director. That won't help. Top to bottom, the culture in the government PSU, government company, government appointee is entirely different than what you need in service industry. So you just if you think by just appointing one officer at whatever level, you can turn around or change the whole culture of the PSU and succeed in service industry, I'm sorry, you'll have to rethink.
In which case, Minister, the obvious question is this. Do you believe the time has come for the government of India to boldly and bluntly say that our ultimate intention is to privatize Air India, and all the revival plans we are putting in place today are with a view to eventual privatization, because the government has no business running an airline?
See, first we have to put Air India on the right track, make it viable. And then if you look around, you will note that the days of national carrier are gone. Anywhere, any country you look at, those days when national carrier was a reality are no longer there. So those facts are before the government. We all know that. But our priority, our whole effort is to make Air India a viable entity.
But the second half of what you said is what I'm going to pick up on. You said the days of national carriers being run by the government are no longer there, they are no longer viable. Are you therefore suggesting that in fact once you've made this airline viable, you will privatize it?
At this point in time, we are not looking at that. What we are looking at, and don't forget that yes, it's difficult for government to run any industry, service industry. But if you look back, up to 2005, Air India or Indian Airlines were still government entities and they were making money. So it's not impossible, or it's not beyond the realm of possibility that government cannot run service industry. Most likely, as I said, it's difficult, I said.
You know,
but let's try the difficult thing.
I'm going to try and explore that difficulty by pointing out a particular fact to you. As you said, before merger, both Indian Airlines and Air India were making a profit. After merger, and the merger is only 5 years old, their combined losses are over 25,000 crore. Their combined debt is over 50,000 crore, whilst their market share has sunk to under 17%.
Mr. Karan Thapa, remember one more thing. In those days, Air India or Indian Airlines had a monopoly, almost. Now it's in a very competitive environment. And overall situation for the aviation sector has also become very difficult.
Let me point this out to you.
Yes.
Before merger, the combined turnover of both airlines was just under 17,000 crore. Today, the combined turnover is just 13,000 crore. It's fallen by over 20%. That's despite the fact you've got new planes. That's despite the fact the airline market as a whole has grown. So you can't blame competition. You're shrinking in size. And the reason comes back to the one you're talking about. Should the government be running a service industry like an airline?
Mr. Karan Thapar, we need not discuss that Air India, the present entity, is in trouble. And we also should remember that all other airlines, not to that extent, but they are also in trouble, financial stress. And the whole environment, even if you look at worldwide, most airline companies are in trouble. So I accept your point that yes, in retrospect, that merger didn't pan out. But you can't blame everything, today's situation, on just that fact.
Minister, let's take a break at that point. When we come back, I want to ask you a critical question about the new management you're going to put in as you hope to revive this airline. That's in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back to Devil's Advocate and an interview with Civil Aviation Minister Ajit Singh. Minister, I want to start this part by putting a fundamental question to you, and in a sense you've hinted at it right through part one, but we are now going to address it up front. Your first task, as you said, is to revive this airline.
Yes.
You've already in April committed to a debt restructuring of 18,000 crore. And you've also committed yourself to new infusion of equity of 30,000 crore over 8 years. But unless you can put in place a proper commercial management and give them freedom to run the airline as they want, you're simply pouring good money down the drain. So will you put proper commercial management in place? That's the first question.
First, let me tell you that we are not putting all that money down the drain, 30,000 crores.
It will be if you don't have proper managers.
We have timelines. We have set up very strict performance standards, and if those performance standards are not met, the whole plan is going to be reviewed.
But you can't meet those performance standards with IAS joint secretaries running the airline. You know that and I know that. So my question still remains. Will you put proper management in place?
Your question remains, and as I said before, there are many PSUs which are doing well. And even
but this is a PSU that's doing badly.
I do agree, it's very difficult. See, let me repeat it. I'll say it again. Yes, service industry is very difficult to run by government, yes. But before merger, they were still both government entities, and they were running successfully. So therefore, that's not the only reason.
No, Minister, you can't turn the clock back to the pre-merger days. You know that and I know that.
All I'm saying
is, given the problem today,
all I'm saying is that even private companies run by professionals in airline industry are failing. But so don't put that emphasis that it's because government managers are incapable. No, listen, government managers are incapable, they can't run anything. No, look at the private companies, why are they failing?
No, just a moment.
They are all run by professionals.
At the end of the day, private companies are accountable to their shareholders, and at the end of the day,
we are not discussing that. Yes, that's a different thing.
The accountability
your point is that put a professional management and it will work.
Will you do that?
No, what you are saying is put a professional management and that will work. That's what you are saying.
I'm not saying it will work, but you have a better chance of working.
Look at the private companies.
So you're saying to me
look at the private. No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. But your whole emphasis that it's because they are IAS, because it's a government company, that's why in this shape. Look around you. In India only, look at the private companies with professional management.
Minister,
so when a company fails, there are many reasons.
I've run out of time, but I have to conclude one thing.
Yes.
You hinted in part one at the possibility or the need for privatization, but only after you've revived the airline, and you didn't commit yourself to it, but you said it's not on the agenda for now. But when we then talk about how you revive the airline, You've talked about money, but you're not talking about good professional management. So I doubt if you're going to revive it at all.
I'm not saying that we will not have good management or we don't have good management at present. And I also pointed out to you that putting one or two guys from a totally different working environment with the working environment that government has, if you think that will solve the problem, you are mistaken.
All right, Minister, I'm going to leave the audience to decide whether they think you have a confident strategy that can succeed or whether you've got the money, but you don't have a clear mind about the management, and whether therefore this confusion will ensure that the troubles of Air India continue. That's a question the audience will have to answer for
Mr.
themselves.
Karan Thapar, whatever I have in mind, the whole thing, you have no clue. So don't say that.
I wait to hear the greater details from you. That leaves us with the hope that there is more to come which you haven't revealed.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
And as I said, our main effort, we are committed to make Air India a success, whatever has to be done, and your suggestions will be welcome.
Minister, thank you very much indeed.
Yes.